Hello and welcome to Fresh Perspectives. My name is Gail. I wanted to mention before I introduce my guest that you probably noticed that the last couple of episodes that you saw were reruns. First there was one with Shirley Erbsmeal, who is one of the instructors for the AARP driver safety course, so that was a really important episode. And I reran episode number 3 with Ann Jackson from the Beaded Forest, where she showed wooden and beaded items that her and her husband make. So anyway, I just wanted to explain that to you. My guest today is somebody who was on a while back. His name is Randy Cannon, and he's here today to talk about what you have to do when you are trying to buy a home. Thank you for coming on, Randy.
Good morning, Gail. Thank you for having me on here again. It's a pleasure to be on your show.
Okay, you're welcome.
I do appreciate the invitation. So a lot of times we often deal with real estate and the industry that I do. I work for a title company. And people oftentimes wonder what is involved in buying and selling a house. And of course, we all at some point have the great American dream of owning property, whether it's cottage, mansion, nice family dwelling. And so the idea is to, at some point, get into the market and purchase a property. And everything looks so easy on TV and advertisements about how easy it is. But there's a few steps that go into it. And of course, obviously, I probably wouldn't have enough time to explain the process from start to finish. But I'd like to hit some of the high points today and explain maybe some of the aspects that people either have not considered, don't understand much about, or like to know more about. And so I'd like to basically start the process with oftentimes when you see a house that you like and you've taken a tour of it and it really fits your needs and your fancy, that you obviously make an offer to the owner, which the owner, depending on their circumstances, accepts. And then typically then you work toward signing a contract. The contract basically is almost close to an ironclad instrument, which basically commits the owner to sell you the property, and it commits you to buying the property. Now, there's a lot of tangencies that go into that as far as whether you can get financing and what the timing is and whether inspections have to be done. There's a lot to it. And again, won't go into that too much. We don't see too oftentimes the inspections and the walkthroughs and things like that. But once you sign that contract, then what happens next? And so what I'd really like to spend the majority of the time on is that process in between the time that you sign the contract and the time that you go to have the deed delivered to you and you sign your mortgage and you're handed the keys and congratulations, you are a brand new homeowner.
Well, it's my understanding that when you're getting ready to buy a home, that first you pretty much have to go to a bank and get approved for a loan, and then they tell you how much you are approved for, how much the loan is. So that's a really big one, probably before you even start looking.
Right. Well, and of course, when you're pre-approved, obviously you don't have specific dollar amounts in front of you. The pre-approved actually is a fairly new. Typically speaking, back in the days, you just applied for a loan and you either got it or you had to come up with the money that you were short. And so the pre-approvals process is kind of a newer one because it allows you to kind of see how much money you have to work with.
Exactly. Have to work with,
exactly. And with the way that the financial markets are, banks are a little bit more cautious about making sure that you don't get in over your head, because they don't make money from ending up with your home. They make money from you paying
your
loan back and the interest and things like that. So, I think most people are familiar with the real estate bubble that burst in 2007, 2008. And we didn't really see it too much in our area of the state because a lot of our houses are not overvalued. If you live down south, especially say in the Carolinas or Georgia, or you lived out west, California, Oregon, Arizona, houses are very priced highly in those parts of the country. And so people were borrowing money that they did not have on houses they could not afford. And so the banks now have tried to avoid having the same thing happen, because when you're overextended with these many loans, that's why a lot of these banks ended up failing. So it is very important to go through that process and see really where you are as far as being able to offer money for the home. And again, there's so many conditions that they kind of rely on each other to kind of carry on to the end of the process. And so these processes kind of all work together, and they have to fall into place exactly the same. So you're right. It is one of those things where you go with the idea that I can make this kind of bid, and this is what I can expect when it comes to financing. And of course, then once you get your contract approved, then you work on the particulars about what that amount exactly is, so you can get locked in to a mortgage commitment with a rate that's attractive to what your needs are. So that'd be the first process. So the next process I kind of want to get into is the process I'm a little more familiar with, and that is the actual title search. So I think most people have heard, maybe if they worked with an attorney, they've heard the term title search, abstract of title, things like that. So maybe some people are familiar with the term, maybe some people, they just think it's another part of the legal process. So I want to get a little bit of a brief explanation of what exactly they're talking about. So what is a title search? Why do we even need title searches? Well, we all have this romantic view of real estate, which is basically two people shaking hands and agreeing on a fair price. And they work out the particulars in between them.
It used to be that way.
It used to be that way. So, in our minds, back many, many, many years ago, you think of two farmers. They're interested in, one's interested in selling to the other a plot of land that he can farm and that he can cultivate. And so they will get together, talk about terms, shake hands, and do what they need to do to effectuate that transfer. Well, those days are kind of gone. There's a lot more to real estate than that. And so as the real estate market evolved, so to speak, the necessity to make sure that you're getting good title. And title searches in our area probably started late 1860s, early 1870s.
Oh, okay.
Of all things, the Chautauqua County clerk used to do title searches. And that's really kind of where the basis now. Not everybody got a title search. In fact, to this day, no one is really obligated to get a title search, but it's recommended, with the many issues that could come up, that you do procure a title search to protect your interests.
Well, you have to, it has to be checked out to see if there's a lien against the property.
Yep, and we will get into that, especially as to the reason why. So these title searches then, as the turn of the 19th century into the 20th century, private companies started getting involved with title searches. And so the question is, so what are we looking for? Why do we need to have that? Well, the first title searches would necessitate going back to the deed from the Holland Land Company. When I was here back in May,
we talked
about
that.
The Holland Land Company, yes. And so you were deemed to have good title when you had a search that went back to the Holland Land Company's first deed. Well, that would make sense in the late 1800s, early 1900s, because you're talking only about maybe 60, 70, 80, 90 years of work. But as we got further into the 20th century, that length of search obviously became more and more, and it became more cumbersome and more cost ineffectual to actually have to do that. And so, the Bar Association got together and they came up with some guidelines and regulations as to what constituted a good title search. And so for our county, it was determined that if you have a search that starts with a warranty deed that's 50 years old, that constitutes having a good start for your title. And so now each county does it a little bit differently. Our county does it differently than Erie County, who does it differently than Cuyahoga County. And so each local bar association sets the standard for what constitutes a good starting point
Oh, okay.
for a title search. And so, yes, you get a deed that starts with a warranty deed. And that search then essentially shows you what the title is. So what is the appeal of having what we call an abstract of title? An abstract of title, and I brought a sample here I'll get to in a minute. An abstract of title basically is a way that an attorney can kind of keep a running examination of the title. Now, can you imagine if you were an attorney and you were doing a real estate deal, and before you could close, you had to go to the county clerk's office and look through the deed indexes, mortgage indexes, lien indexes, any other indexes that are necessary. Well, you as the attorney, it would take you a large amount of time. It would basically cost you time to have to do that. If you did that and you were content, you could write up your examination and you could close on that. Well, the next attorney, when he goes to represent the parties, here again, he's got to go to the county clerk's office, run the deeds, the mortgages, the liens, and you can see where this would just not really make much sense. And so what the attorneys start doing is hiring title abstractors to give them an abstract of title that they could examine. The abstractor would go to the clerk's office and run those same indexes and put together sort of a condensed version of what the record looked like. If they had that paper product in their hand, the next time the deal went through, you weren't forced to start from the beginning. You could continue, and you'd have the abstractor run the deeds, mortgages, and lien indexes from the last time. And you can see where I'm going. As it just continues to build upon itself. So what does a title search look like? Now, I brought a title abstract here. This is kind of a poor representation because it doesn't have a cover on it. It's actually my title search.
Oh, okay.
But as you can see, it's basically made up of pages, and I don't know if you can see. Let's see if I can get it where the camera.
Yeah, hold it so it kind of faces this camera over here.
So you can kind of see where it's a condensed version of what's happened to the title since then. And it's, again, a summary of, as the person has run the indexes, things that they would find in the certificates. And as you can see, it kind of continues on with additional items all the way down to the end of the abstract. Now, I have not had mine updated in a while, so that's why it's an older abstract. There's newer abstracts, but an attorney would take that product and they would examine from start to finish to make sure that everything looked okay. So what kind of items are we looking for? Well, we're looking for anything that would be a encumbrance or a lien on the property. So before I get into that though, there is a definition that I think I have to make of exactly what a title search is meant to do and what it's not meant to do. Because there's people that we get questions from people who will have a misconceived notion of what their title search is doing. So the definition of the title search is that basically it is an abstract. Someone has gone in, looked at the records of the clerk, and then broken it down into, like I said, an abstract as a condensation of the information into smaller bites. And so it shows deeds, it shows mortgages, it shows judgments and liens and leases and rights-of-ways and easements and taxes and things of that nature. There's more to it than just that. I'm just kind of summarizing. But that it's a summary because those things are all important for the attorney when he examines it to determine what title you've got, whether you've got good title, whether you've got a title that needs to be cured, whether the things that need to be disposed of, things of that nature. So that's what the intention is. It is to show you exactly what the title record is as it appears in the county clerk's office. And to be in, again, more manageable bite-sized portions to examine. Now, what it is not, and I do get people that say, well, will my title search show me when my house was built? do get that question quite a bit.
Oh, yeah.
And unfortunately, the title search does not show when improvements were done. And so if they say, can you show me from my search when my house was built? Oftentimes, there is no real clear-cut answer.
Depending on how long ago it was built.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
there are clues in a search which might indicate when your house was built. If you have what they call a building and loan mortgage, say in the 30s or the 40s or the 50s, that might be an indication that, hey, you borrowed money to build a house. That oftentimes is not the case. You don't see that typically in the older searches. Other indications might be, okay, when did the assessment change? Now, if you have a really old search, you have something in the front of the search which are called tax searches, and they were basically there to search whether the taxes were paid. Now, sometimes they gave the assessment. So if you had a property that was assessed for a low amount in the 20s, and suddenly, toward the end of the 20s or the 30s, it was suddenly assessed for a much larger amount, there's a clue that maybe that's when the house was built. But again, these are very rare instances, so oftentimes the search will not show when the house is built. And I do get those questions, and I tell people there's other ways of finding out, but the search really is not designed to do that. Another thing that a search does not do is it does not tell you, yes, you have good title. We often say that a search basically is not an indication of good or bad. It's the record. It shows what it is. And so it takes then an interpretation of that search to determine whether title is good. So if I've got people that say, well, I've got a title search, does that mean I have good title? Well, you've got a search which shows what the record is, but it's not going to out and out tell you whether you've got good or bad title. It's, again, it doesn't pass judgment. It just shows the record the way it is. And so that's another indication. The third thing that's often a misconception is, does the title search act as a survey that shows where my boundary lines are? Because if you get into dispute with a neighbor, or you want to know where your stakes are, and you go into the search, you're thinking, well, the search should actually show me where my boundary lines are. Well, the search does contain a description of your property. It can be in the old style chains and links, as I think you and I discussed back in May.
Right.
It could be in something called rods. It could be in more modern measurements of feet and inches. So it's a description, but the description doesn't show you to your review where those exact boundary lines are. So that's where you would call in a surveyor,
yes.
who works with the description to show you where your boundary lines actually are. And so I tell people, I say, you know, I wish it was such that a title search could show you exactly where those are, but at that point, if it's a dispute serious enough, you have to hire an attorney or a surveyor to come in and determine where those exact boundaries are. So those are the things that a title search is not. The other question I get is, do I really need a title search? Now, we are not in the legal business, so we don't tell you, yes, you do, or no, you don't. Again, we just represent a searching of the records, and we're not there to tell you what you should or shouldn't do in your closing. That's why most people hire a real estate attorney.
Yeah, I was just going to ask that. That's what they wind up having to do.
Exactly.
Is to get an attorney.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
most people, and we understand that when you are going to do a real estate transaction, you want to keep it as simple and affordable as possible. No one really wants to spend a lot of time and money
No.
on things like that. But so, because I do get people that will, now the two top reasons that people will give me for not getting a title search is, number one, I'm buying a piece of property next door to my property, it's vacant. So what possibly could be wrong with that piece of property if nothing's ever really been done to it, if it's unimproved, if it's never been built on, if I don't have people coming and going over it? Really, why would I need a title search? Because there's just no activity.
Yeah, you might get in a big fight with a neighbor on the other
Well,
side
and
of the
we'll get
piece
into
of
that.
property.
The other reason I get is because, well, the neighbor next door to me is elderly. He owned it, his father owned it, his grandfather owned it, his great-grandfather owned it. It's been in the family for 120 years. So what could possibly be wrong with a property that's owned by family members. It's not like it's changed hands. It's been the same family. They've done the same things to that property for so many years. So why would I need a search? And both those reasons on the outside of it, when you think about them, you're thinking, well, yeah, why would I need? Because what risk is there? And I can't get into all the risks today because we'd simply run out of time. But I like to kind of touch on a couple topics that kind of, if I could say, debunk those notions that you really don't necessarily need a title search based on that it's vacant or that's been owned for millennial by the same family. Oftentimes, the problems that we have with searches, especially if they've been in the family, is making sure that the property has descended properly from generation to generation to generation. I'll give you an example. Years and years ago, I had one that it was a 100-acre farm. I can't remember what town it was in, but essentially the great-great-grandfather owned the property, and he essentially split these 100 acres between his two sons. So 50 acres to each son. Well, son number one built a farm on it. Son number two built his own farm. Well, son number two had a catastrophic fire that burned his barn to the ground.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And he basically became so discouraged, he gave up farming and he moved away.
Oh, okay.
So son number two essentially absorbed the 50 acres that
He never actually purchased his brother's half of the property.
Because the other brother just gave up and moved away. And so you have this land that's sitting there.
So there was no transaction.
Exactly. And so son number two kept his peace and kind of cultivated his brother's parcel. And so this continued for a few decades. And so when it finally came time to sell the property, the question became, whatever happened to son number one? Well, we're talking now 60 or 70 years ago. Now you can only imagine if you've been out of contact with a family member or a predecessor for 60 or 70 years, much can change. And so we get those questions, has the property properly been bequested or heired or devised to the next generation, so that when you get to the elderly gentleman who's willing to sell you his property, even if it went through his family members and his fathers and his grandfathers, had all those potential loose ends be tied up. Do we have a family member that's passed away? And did his heirs have a chance to get there?
Right.
So that's
exactly.
one thing. And again, I will tell you, no two properties are alike. And so when I give you examples, these examples may not be applicable
to anybody else.
But each one has their own kind of particulars that go to it.
Yeah, because the other brother that wound up moving away could have children that want their half of the property that they probably would want to inherit, or at least be able to be paid money for
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's the thing with the passing of time, because it becomes more complicated. So whereas you had one brother who might have had 3 children, who might have each had 3 or 4 children each, if we go 3 or 4 generations, now instead of dealing with maybe one individual, 2 individuals, you might be tracking down 15, 16 or more individuals, which by laws of inheritance would have a share of this property. And with the passing of time, it becomes more difficult not only to determine who has those interests, but how do I get in touch with them to ask them to work with us in a deed. I mean, you might be talking about 16 different places in the country that you'd have to track people down to find out where they are. The other,
another thing I just thought of was the possibility that maybe the brother that stayed on the lot, on the property, had been the one paying the taxes on it every year too.
Right.
That would be another part of the situation too.
And really in a way, it's more, and I'm not a lawyer by any stretch of imagination, but It's all a matter of what they call occupation. Are you using the land? How are you keeping it maintained? Are you improving on it? Are you mowing
Are you
it?
paying half of the taxes?
Yeah. Now, the
Yeah.
taxes don't constitute actual notice of occupation. It's more the important part of what you're doing with the land that you're claiming. And really, in a way, that's what it boils down to oftentimes, is can anyone come in there and challenge your occupation of the land? And again, each one has a little bit of a different strain to it. So there's no two solutions to every problem. But with the other reason of, well, the property's vacant, so what could possibly be wrong with it? No one's really built on it. And just to give you one idea of where you might have an issue is if for some reason you've got neighbors who use that land to access other lands that they have. So in your mind, you might look at it and see no activity, but this might be used as a way, especially if it has road frontage, to access other lands that someone might own that is not on the road. And so you buy the property and suddenly you find out that you've got maybe an oil gas company driving across your land, or maybe you've got people that have a cabin back in the woods that are driving across your land. And so suddenly where you thought, hey, I've got this nice quiet piece of property that adjoins my land, suddenly now you have a piece of property that might be subject to rights of others to cross that piece of property. So again, and this is not a pitch to get a title search, but it's things that people should consider when they're tempted to say, well, it's a simple piece of property. It's not worth much, therefore I really don't need a title search. And again, we're not in the business of telling you yes you do or no you don't. But it's a cautionary tale. Before you decide for sure that you don't need a title search, it's often advised to consult with someone who can give you good legal advice. Because if you go into a contract and you buy a piece of property without having that foreknowledge, you inherit whatever piece of problems come along with that. And if you then go to sell it, you may not be so blessed to have someone who's willing to take the property at your say-so. They may want a title search done, and then they may want you to cure any problems before they're willing to buy the property from you. So we kind of say the pound of prevention type thing, that oftentimes it's convenient.
An ounce of prevention.
Yeah,
an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Exactly right. So it's oftentimes better for you to kind of cure things now, because a little now or a lot later, so to speak. So that's really the two reasons, the questions I get is why do we need one? So we kind of looked at why do we need to do one in the first place, the origins of why we need to do them, what a title search is, and what a title search isn't. So then the next question becomes, what are things that you can find in a title search, and how do they need to be dealt with? So I like to break it down into two categories. You know, the categories are the liens, and then the other category is encumbrances, and what you want to prevent for yourself. So let's start with liens. So a title search basically will show you potential liens against the property, that the liens are put on the property in the first place, so that if a person goes to sell or mortgage the property, those liens have what they call first place.
Oh, okay.
In other words, if you go to get a mortgage, the bank would be behind in priority with these other liens. And so really we're talking about judgments, we're talking about state tax warrants, we're talking about federal tax liens, we're talking about mortgages, and we're also talking about property taxes. These are all things that if you buy a piece of property, your purchase could be subject. So a search will show you, does the prior owner have a mortgage that needs to be paid off?
Right, yes.
Does the current property owner have judgments, whether they're credit cards or other kinds of judgments that could be placed on the property as a lien? Has the property owner been keeping up with the real property taxes? Are they paid? Because again, these are all important issues, because if they don't surface at the time of the closing, there's a good chance that they will surface later. And with any attorney that you go through, when they do their exam, they will be looking for those things as to what they need to do to satisfy any of these liens, so that when you purchase a property, you have what's called clean title. That you're not worried about someone coming and knocking on your door with their hand out. That's a kind of an archaic expression, saying, hey, I have a lien on this property. I'm in first place. I want money for this. And
Okay, so it's really probably, if you find out that there is a lien against the property you want to buy, if you find out there's a lien against the property, it almost might be a good idea to decide you're going to look elsewhere for a piece of property or something.
There are ways, though, of curing it. And we always tell people that oftentimes there's ways. It's very rare when you have a deal that's toxic, if I can use that word, where it just is not touchable whatsoever. Oftentimes, if an attorney can reach out to those creditors or those lien holders, that lender, and say, what is it going to take to get a discharge or release of your interest in the property? And depending on what the purchase price is, there may be money for those items. And again, it's where we don't necessarily say that you have to have an attorney with a real estate deal, but it is recommended, because they are there to protect basically your interest, and to see, hey, can a lien be disposed of to ensure that you are going to have, because really in a way it's rare when you have a property that you're interested in buying that's completely free of a mortgage, or there's some sort of a lien of some sort. Most people, if you're in the business long enough, you have a mortgage. So a mortgage is not prohibitive. You just have to make sure that it is going to be paid off at closing, and any other liens that are on the property. And there is someone there who is holding money once the deal is cut, to make sure that that money is appropriated to take care of those liens. And again, most of them are not. Now, if you get a property that is what we call underwater, where in other words, where the value of the property is less than what is owed on it, that's a whole different animal. And I'm not even going to try to attempt to define what you do in those cases, because there is a lot of maneuvering in those cases. So we'll kind of avoid those properties that we consider to be underwater, because there is a lot of work that has to be done, and a lot of negotiation and a lot of give and take to try to consider to rescue those properties. So if you've got a property that's truly valued at less than what the property has on it, those are the kind of property that people try to steer clear of, because it's just really not a win proposition. So we're talking about properties that can essentially be taken care of, that there's still value, there's still equity in the property to deal with these liens that you find out. And they can come in a wide variety. But again, if you have an attorney that's working for you as a buyer, he is the one that would essentially kind of do the calculations and see if there's enough money left over, so that you're not then saddled with these continuing liens and judgments and things like that. So it's an evaluation process for sure. So
anyway, in other words, when you get ready to buy a piece of property or a house or whatever, just be very, very careful.
Right.
You know.
Exactly. And you just want to make sure. And I always tell people, you know what? You're not obligated really to do. If you are interested in buying a piece of property and the seller is interested in selling it, you're not really obligated to do anything. But just remember that whatever is valid on that property when they're selling it, you inherit it. And it may not be right now that you have to deal with it, but there's a fairly better than even chance that at some point you'll have to deal with it. So the appeal of buying something now is there, but just remember that, you know, the kicking the can down the road, you may not have to deal with it now, but you may have to deal with it at some point. And we always find out that the longer the time has passed, the more difficult it becomes to resolve issues. I'll use this as another example. So if you buy a piece of property, the owner tells you that there's no mortgages on the property, they haven't been paying any mortgages, and you're content with their word, and you buy the property. When you go to sell it, a search is done, and they find out that, okay, the previous owner had a mortgage. They could very, very well be telling the truth that they weren't paying on it because the mortgage was paid off, but that mortgage was never discharged. So now you have a buyer saying, well, I want, even though it's not your mortgage, even though it's not being paid on, either from you or your predecessor who said I was not paying any mortgages, I want a discharge of that mortgage. Well, again, that time factor. Who was the lender back then? Is that lender still in business? Has that lender farmed out their mortgages? Has that lender been swallowed up by another entity who may have been merged into another entity? Now you're looking at going back to a mortgage, what we call a mortgagee, who may not exist, who may have defaulted themselves, who may not even be in the same state as we are, going back 10, 15, 20 or more years to see if they can give you a discharge. And it's oftentimes the level of cooperation may not always be there. And I think with your listeners, they're all familiar with being on the line with an 800 number, talking not to a person, but to a
automate.
Computer. Yeah, exactly. And so if you call that bank's number, if you can find their number, you may be going through a bank of automated responses, and it may require you many, and I'm going to say hours or days or weeks, to get to somebody who can review that file to see if there is a balance, an account, whether it's all paid off. And so even though you don't really run the risk of being foreclosed on, because again, there may be no balance on that mortgage, you are now involved in a headache of chasing down this discharge of mortgage from a bank that, again, they may have archived their records. Their records may have been swallowed up in a larger bank, or simply their records aren't what they are. So we are not in the process of advising you as an attorney what your next step is, but it kind of gives you an idea that by doing a search, if you were to buy from the seller, it would reveal that mortgage, which even if he says or she says, I'm not paying on it, which is the case, it gives you the opportunity to say, okay, great, where was your last payment sent? Who did you pay it to? Who can we contact so we can get that mortgage discharged? Because, and again, in that time is an enemy. The longer you wait, the harder it gets to find someone. And I think most people will realize that once you're closed on a deal, the people that you're dealing with as far as their interests lose interest in actually trying to help you.
Oh, no.
Trying to resolve your interests. But again, it's not to scare people away, but it's just a cautionary tale, if I might say. Be cautious of what you're getting yourself into, because it may end up being more of a process than you're thinking. So that kind of deals with the lien aspect of it, making sure that any financial obligations which could attach to the property are dealt with. Do you have any questions about that before I move on to encumbrances?
No, go ahead.
Okay, all right. So then the next flip side of that is encumbrances. So searches show mortgages, judgments, and liens, but they also show other interesting items such as leases, easements, rights of way, other ways of encumbering the property, and each one has a different way of dealing with it. Now again, we as the abstract company aren't there to tell you whether you should worry about a lease, a right of way, or an easement. Some of them are standard. So if you buy a piece of property and you get your electricity from somewhere, you more than likely had to give a easement to the utility company to get the line from the line that runs along the road to your house.
Oh, okay.
And so, whether it's, National Grid, National Fuel, telephone company, those are easements which essentially, yes, they're on your property. Yes, they can dig up your property at any time to maintain them. But in a way, you're not too worried because that's how you get your utilities.
Right.
Electricity, telephone, gas, in some degrees, your water. So when we see them, there's still encumbrances because you sign a right-of-way or an easement. But oftentimes the attorney will just tell you, yes, it does burden your property, but it also benefits you because you wouldn't.
Right, because otherwise you'd have to live without it.
You'd have to live without it. So for the most cases, and again, we don't tell you not to worry about it. We don't tell you to worry about it. We leave that up to your legal counsel to tell you. But those are the most common kinds that we see. Now, we oftentimes see oil and gas leases. Now, if you live in a village, you live in a city, that's usually not an issue because there's no really way to drill within a municipality.
Right.
So that's not really a item that you see in the villages and the municipalities. So if you live in a town, if you live out in the middle of a town,
like we do,
or if you have large acreages and you might be going through your searches, you might see oil and gas leases. Mm-hmm. Now, oil and gas leases are a topic all into themselves.
Oh, yeah.
Because there's just so many facets. And I'm not here to try to explain to you the oil and gas industry because, again, there's just so many different aspects to it. But people say, do I need to worry about this oil and gas lease?
Mm-hmm. Probably.
If you're buying a piece of property, yes, there might be an actual apparatus, we call it, that's on your property, which is basically, looking for oil and gas. You might have the gathering tanks. I'm sure you've seen them in different parts that are on properties. Mm-hmm. And some parts of oil and gas you might not even see because it's below the surface.
Now, about this, what do they call that? Something domain?
Eminent domain?
Yeah. How did that ever come to be that, like these oil and gas companies can actually take some of your property and use it like for gas lines and things like that?
Right.
From people who own the property, I've never been able to understand why.
That's a really
why they are allowed.
That's a really good
to
question.
do that. Just because they're big money-making business gives them a lot of power or something?
That's a really good question. And again, I'm not going to give you the legal standpoint because I'm not an attorney, but I can tell you my experience with them. Mm-hmm. Eminent domain oftentimes refers to what is the public good. Mm-hmm. We see eminent domain a little more rarely than they used to see it. So if you had property, say, between the 1930s and the 1960s, you might have run into or seen in the searches what they call eminent domain proceedings. Mm-hmm. Now, it was usually with larger utility companies, mm-hmm. whether it was a gas company mm-hmm. or whether it was an electric company. Mm-hmm. And so at the time that they were putting in electric lines mm-hmm. or putting in a gas line, mm-hmm. it was determined that the general public would benefit from having a large electrical line, whether it's wires or underground lines, or if it was a gas pipeline, they would benefit from having, so even if you may not have consented to having this put in your property, the utility company could go to the court system and say, hey, look, we are petitioning you to give us an order of eminent domain that even though people may not necessarily consent to it, we can prove that the public would benefit from having electricity or natural gas, or whatever the case is. And we don't see it as often now because everyone pretty much has electricity and gas.
Right.
There are still times when you might be in an area of the county where you don't have certain, whether it's sewer or water or electric, and it's determined that if we have this line that goes in, be it along the road, be it along a lake shore, be it along whatever the case, and it runs from line to line, it would benefit everyone in the area to have this. And if they can prove to the court's satisfaction that yes, people would benefit from this, even if it's an inconvenience to others to have this on their property, they can then go ahead with it. But it's more rare now. We do have searches.
Yeah, I just wondered because there was somebody, a company, well, they were calling it, I think, the Millennial Pipeline, or the Millennial Pipeline they wanted to put through our neighborhood. And I mean, they would have liked to have run it. Actually, nothing ever wound up coming from it, but some of the neighbors on that side of the road got together and decided, that they would propose to have them at least run it at the back sides of the property away from the road instead of right by all of our houses and everything. And so we thought maybe it was starting to look like maybe they would go along with that idea, but now they've never even come through the neighborhood with it, so I don't know if they decided another area was better to run it through or what. I'm not sure what happened, but it just doesn't seem really right for something that they are going to benefit from. The big money-making people. I mean, they might give you a little bit of something, but they're the ones that are going to make most of the money.
Oh, yeah, and I think there's a feasibility to it. I don't really know what goes into a study of where to put a pipeline. There's a lot that goes to, obviously there's an economic study, there's an environmental study, there's basically a topographical study just to see, is it practical where to put this line? And I remember that line that you're particularly talking about because a lot of the neighbors, especially that were going to be bordering right on it, were how this is going to impact us.
Right,
and there was some discussion, and nothing really ever came of it. It's a double-edged sword. I'll be honest with you, because you want to have the benefits of cheap, good energy. But you just don't really want it to be outside your house. And I'll let you know that kind of the trend, and I'm sure that you've seen this before, we're looking at ways of transitioning from traditional fossil fuels to more updated, economical and environmental friendly fuels. And so really the kind of the trend that we're seeing is with windmills. I'm sure if you've been around the county, you've seen places where have windmills. They haven't really caught on as much in other parts of the country where there's wind farms or solar farms. Now they're more, you see them more around the country. But in kind of doing these, we're seeing people say, yeah, the wind turbines are a great idea. Where do we put them? Well, we want to put them in places where on top of hills, and places where it's not as populated, where there's more, where we get more wind.
Have you been over to Arkwright?
I have not been. I know.
We went over there to see what it looked like one time, and it was, I mean, these windmills are sitting in people's yards. It's hideous.
Yep. Oh yeah.
It's hideous.
And you know, you hit on a very good point, because they're supposedly energy efficient, but nobody really wants them in their yard.
No.
So what do? Well, you know, maybe out west where there's wide expanses of land that's not really improved, that makes more sense. We live in a smaller area, so they're, as you mentioned, they're more noticeable. I think people, if they can be, because there is a certain way of reaching out and trying to explain to them, hey, look, you benefit from this. Plus, you know, we can talk about reimbursement for having what we call a leased windmill on your property. I've not been out that way. I believe you're talking about Ball Hill in that particular area.
Probably. I'm not sure. I'm not real familiar. We just went through there one time to get a look at how
and we
things
we do see those. We do see those. I don't know if they'll ever really catch on. I'm not really a prognosticator to tell you whether more traditional energy is going to be replaced by the new wave of energy. But I think people are starting to see kind of a getting away of, you know, having land taken from them to be appropriated for fossil fuel development and things like that. So, but yeah, getting back to that, that was a time when it was determined, because some people would resist. I don't want you laying a pipeline here. I don't want you putting an easement here. And then that entity going to the courts and saying, look, this is going to benefit everyone that lives in X area. Mm-hmm. And even if we get people who are not really wanting it in their yard, it's got to go somewhere. Because if we put it somewhere where no one is, then it's just not going to go in. And so we've seen that in the past. There's a lot of utility lines that still feed off of these properties, that some of them could have been taken by eminent domain, and it's communication lines, it's, you know, like I said, electric, water, sewer, things of that nature, where it was determined that it was necessity. And for the most part, I think people even forget that they're there, unless they have kind of like a grinder pump, you know, in their yard. I think for the most part they forget that they're there, and so it kind of goes by the wayside. But when it first happens, that's where you really get people that are up in arms. And so that kind of deals with that point. And of course, that would show up if your land was taken for purposes of eminent domain. That would show up in the search as well, and the attorney might just say it's part of doing business. Mm-hmm.
Well, we're down to less than 5 minutes.
Oh my goodness, where did the time fly?
I know. So if you had a lot that you still wanted to say today, we're going to have to schedule you for another episode. But anything, I want to suggest that anything more that you really would like to get out today?
I would just say, you know what, whenever you get into a real estate deal, because we were talking about, this is the topic of the intricacies, is informed consumer is the best consumer. Mm-hmm. You know, make decisions based on research. Mm-hmm. Make decisions based on facts. The appeal of a property, you know, the rush of buying a piece of property, it's certainly something that motivates you. But whether or not you decide to get a search, whether or not you decide to go through an attorney, I would just say basically get as informed as you can on your options, on the costs, on the benefits, of the downside of everything, because that person then can make decisions based on that that information they've received, as opposed to kind of being what they're told or how they feel or what they're being advised to do by a friend, relative, or neighbor. And being informed is the best way to protect yourself in the long run.
Okay. Another thing that I wanted to suggest is maybe people, when they're looking to buy, for example, a house or even just a piece of property to build on or whatever, but especially if they're building, looking at houses that have already been built, probably it's best to have a wish list made up. you know, what exactly do you want in a house? Do you want a full basement?
That's an awesome question.
You know,
That's a really good idea. A lot of it depends on where you are in your life. Are you single? Are you married? Do you have kids? Do you have grown kids? Are you retiring? What is it that you really want to get out of your house? Do you want a house that's quiet and you can have a garden? Do you want a house that's convenient and literally blocks from grocery, post office, bank, other amenities? Do you want a house that's close to a particular school district, that's in a particular school district? Do you want a house that you can build onto? Do you want a house that you can maybe invest in? Do you want a house that you can maybe someday rent out to? There's a lot of consideration. I say probably the best way to answer that, because there's no way to answer every question. What do you envision, not only for your life as it is right now,
but for the future?
For your future. Is it a house that you want to grow old in? Is it a house that you want to retire in? You know, putz around on the back 40 with your tractor and your mower? Or is it one of those ones where you're like, you know what, I've raised my kids. Now I'm looking for a house that basically I can retire into, that I don't have to really put any work into, that I don't really have to labor at, that I can truly enjoy. And so the question is, where are you at now, and where will you be in 10, 15, 20 years?
Well, you know, I've seen the insides of some of those apartments at the Portage Hill apartment building here in Mayville. And I remember the first time I saw one of those apartments and saw one of the bathrooms for the first time. I mean, the shower is like one end of the bath. I mean, you know, the whole floor and wall around there is tile, and you know, I mean, you could literally wheel somebody in a wheelchair into one of those bathrooms, you know? And I mean, it is just absolutely the best thing for somebody who's really elderly, you know, and can't step over the edge of a tub or anything anymore. And one of my first thoughts about that was, my gosh, anybody who's building a brand new home should put a bathroom like that in the house on the first floor, you know? I mean, seriously.
Yeah.
Because if you're building a house that you intend to spend your entire life in, you know, you should make it so that you actually can live there your entire life.
Right.
So.
Yep. It's all consideration, because, and more modern houses I think are set up for that very particular reason. You still will see some Cape Cod style houses, but you're seeing a lot of ranch style houses too, because then you've got everything
on one floor. Right.
No stair climbing, no having to get from one end to the other.
Right.
So convenience.
No having to put in one of those chairlift things to get yourself up and down stairs. Well, we have come to the end of another episode of Fresh Perspectives, and I'm pretty sure we didn't cover everything you wanted to say today.
That's okay.
But there are more Saturdays available that you could sign up for. And I want to thank you for taking the time to come in.